Episode 1D, the Emanuel Swedenborg equation. Latter-day Saints are accustomed to viewing their beliefs about heaven as unique within the broader Christian tradition. Many, such as Craig Blomberg, professor at Denver Seminary, argue that Doctrine and Covenants 76 hits evangelical Christians like a bolt out of the blue with its elaboration of 4 possible destinies of humanity. However, Brigham John Bowen has suggested that the notion of degrees of glory, which many believe to be uniquely Mormon, was actually not so in the 19th century. This idea was not novel, Bowen posits, but part of a broader theological tradition. These conflicting perspectives challenge the belief that Smith's vision of heaven and hell was entirely original. So what's the basis of this contention? How does Emanuel Swedenborg factor into this theological debate? Let's explore Emanuel Swedenborg and his influence. Emanuel Swedenborg was a Swedish scientist, philosopher, theologian, and mystic who lived between 1688 until 1772. Over his lifetime, Swedenborg transitioned from a career in science and engineering to a focus on theology and spirituality, where he developed unique views on the nature of God, heaven, and the human soul. His theological writings became influential in various religious movements, including their supposed indirect influence on Mormonism. In the 1730s, Swedenborg became increasingly interested in spiritual matters and was determined to find a theory to explain how matter relates to spirit. Swedenborg's desire to understand the order and the purpose of creation first led him to investigate the structure of matter and the process of creation itself. In the Principia, the first part of his Opera Philosophica et Mineralia, he outlined his philosophical method, which incorporated experience, geometry, the means by which the inner order of the world can be known, and the power of reason. He also outlined his cosmology, which included the first presentation of his nebular hypothesis. Swedenborg proposed that there were a multiplicity of heavens, divided into celestial, spiritual, and natural parts. In Heaven and Hell, Swedenborg allegorically likens both the nature of each heaven as well as the illumination in the sky of each heaven, to the sun, moon, and stars respectively. He states that the sun of the celestial heaven and the moon of the spiritual kingdom is the Lord. Swedenborg wrote, "There are 3 heavens, entirely distinct from each other, an inmost or third, a middle or second, and an outmost or first. These have the same order and relation to each other as the highest part of man, or his head, the middle part, or body, and the lowest, or feet, or as the upper, the middle, and the lower stories of a house. In the same order is the divine that goes forth and descends from the Lord. Consequently, he, from the necessity of order, is threefold. The divine that flows in from the Lord and is received in the third or inmost heaven is called celestial, and in consequence, the angels there are called celestial angels. The divine that flows in from the Lord and is received in the second or middle heaven is called spiritual, and in consequence the angels there are called spiritual angels, while the divine that flows in from the Lord and is received in the outmost or first heaven is called natural. But as the natural of that heaven, unlike the natural of the world, has the spiritual and celestial within it, that heaven is called the spiritual and the celestial natural, and in consequence the angels there are called the spiritual natural and celestial natural. Those who receive influx from the middle or second heaven, which is the spiritual heaven, are called spiritual natural, and those who receive influx from the third or inmost heaven, which is the celestial heaven, are called celestial natural. The spiritual natural angels and the celestial natural angels are distinct from each other. Nevertheless, they constitute one heaven, because they are in the same degree. Swedenborg's multiple heavens conception of the afterlife resembles the Latter-day Saint view of the afterlife described in Doctrine and Covenants, section 76. On February 16, 1832, Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon had a supposed joint visionary experience in Hiram, Ohio, while meditating on the meaning of John 5:29. The vision they described was recorded as a revelation known to early Latter-day Saints as the Vision, and later canonized as Doctrine and Covenants 76. Like heaven and hell, the vision rejected a binary afterlife of eternal heaven or hell as inconsistent with God's love for humanity. Instead, The vision described a heaven divided into 3 degrees of glory, called the celestial, terrestrial, and telestial kingdoms, and likened to the glory of the sun, moon, and stars, respectively. According to Fair LDS, the shared conception of a multi-tiered heaven derives from the New Testament writings attributed to the Apostle Paul, available to both Smith and Swedenborg through the Bible. There are also celestial bodies and bodies terrestrial, but the glory of the celestial is one, and the glory of the terrestrial is another. There is one glory of the sun, and another glory of the moon, and another glory of the stars, for one star differeth from another star in glory. So also is the resurrection of the dead. 1 Corinthians 15:42. Fair continues on. The claim of similarity rests on a few superficial similarities between Joseph and Swedenborg in the Bible, and ignores the many marked differences between them. Even if one is not inclined to grant Joseph Smith prophetic status, it seems far more plausible that his view of a 3-tiered heaven derives from the New Testament and not from Swedenborg. Swedenborg was hardly the first theologian or thinker to suggest that heavenly rewards were not all identical, but graduated into degrees of glory. The discussion and debate about the fate of the righteous in heaven goes back to the earliest Christian centuries. Non-LDS scholar Emma Disley indicates that the primary sources for the idea of different degrees of glory are Matthew 5, John 14:2, "In my Father's house are many mansions," 1 Corinthians 15:41, "Stars differ in glory from one another," Matthew 21-4, "Parable of the vineyard." We encounter a major issue with Fair's assertion, which is, nowhere in Matthew 5, John 14:2, or Matthew 21-4 do we get the same description of heaven as we did from Paul or Swedenborg. John 14:2 speaks of many mansions, but that does not say 3, and implied to be many, many more. Fair asserts, the issues arguing against borrowing come in at least 3 different ways. 1. A common source for both Swedenborg and Joseph. 2. No early charge that Joseph had borrowed from Swedenborg. 3. The similarities are superficial, while there are many deep differences. Part of the basis for Doctrine and Covenants section 76 is clearly rooted in the New Testament, and Swedenborg cannot be the source for the notion of 3 heavens because of this. Paul does not go too deeply into this topic, so for Fair to claim there are many deep differences is an attempt to deflect the idea Joseph borrowed from Swedenborg's original ideas concerning Paul's teachings. We see them make poor attempts using Matthew and John as a defense, when all they needed to do was point out Swedenborg's view of terrestrial was not the same as Joseph's, though that defense does fall flat nonetheless. We see in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul touches on the concept of the 3 kingdoms of heaven, though not in the exact way it is later elaborated in Latter-day Saint theology. The passage where Paul refers to different types of resurrected bodies and the glory of the afterlife has been interpreted as loosely aligning with the LDS doctrine of the 3 degrees of glory, celestial, terrestrial, and telestial. However, Paul does not go into specific detail about 3 separate kingdoms of heaven in this chapter. Instead, his language focuses on different glories and bodies associated with resurrection, which later LDS theology builds upon. Fair's arguments often attempt to obscure Joseph Smith's likely influences, such as the teachings of Emanuel Swedenborg, who elaborated on multi-tiered heavens and used terms like terrestrial in ways that parallel Joseph's own later revelations. While Fair dismisses this connection by highlighting differences between Swedenborg's and Joseph's interpretations, it's worth noting that Swedenborg's multi-tiered view of heaven, based on Paul's teachings, predated and may have informed early LDS theology. This possibility becomes even more plausible given Joseph's exposure to diverse theological ideas of the time and the influence of figures like Sidney Rigdon. As you can see, Paul spends much of 1 Corinthians 15 discussing the resurrection of the dead and the nature of the resurrected body. Fair continues its poor attempt to defend Joseph stealing the teaching by stating, "The charge of Joseph borrowing idea from Swedenborg only occurs much later. Second, we don't really see any early charges that Joseph Smith borrowed from Swedenborg. That is, with the Book of Mormon, we have a nearly constant stream of claims that Joseph stole his ideas in the book from somewhere else. Spalding's manuscript, Ethan Smith's view of the Hebrews, and so on. But we don't see anyone claiming that Joseph borrowed from Swedenborg until D. Michael Quinn makes the claim late in the 20th century. This is nothing more than a straw man argument, as Joseph was converting mainly those who were uneducated and unaware of Swedenborg and his general church of the New Jerusalem, which only had a few small branches between New York City, Boston, and Philadelphia. Those with an education tended to be raised to within leadership positions of the church, buying off their silence within a seat of power. Fair once again tries to be coy when they state, the lack of an early attack on Joseph on these grounds is thus problematic for a couple of reasons. First, while we know that Joseph probably had some contact with Swedenborg's writings by 1839, the same kinds of arguments made for early access to Swedenborg can also be made for those around Joseph. Swedenborg's work was, after all, in the public library of Joseph's hometown, and it was widely published. The same kinds of individuals who would have talked to Joseph certainly could have talked to those around him, and yet we don't get the claims of his being influenced. And this means that it's quite likely that this discussion is purely of more recent manufacture. Fair isn't lying, they are just misleading. If one does some simple research, they will discover there were some Swedenborgian communities in New York State, though they were not as widespread or influential as other religious movements like the Baptists or Methodists. The Swedenborgian Church formally began to take shape in the U.S. after the 1780s, and by the 1820s, there were small congregations in parts of New York, such as in New York City and Albany. However, there is little evidence of a large formal Swedenborgian presence in the Finger Lakes region, where Palmyra is at the time. Swedenborgianism was not popular in Ohio or further west, and this concept Joseph incorporated into his faith came after the move from New York State, making sure he left unwanted past history behind himself. Once again, Fair demonstrates its talent for misdirection. They assert Joseph's early critics and readers were quite familiar with Swedenborg. One early critique of Joseph compared him to Swedenborg, since both were regarded as false prophets, but said nothing about Swedenborg as a source for Joseph's ideas. A second critique complained about the lack of symbolism in Joseph's ideas. While regarding Swedenborg as a fraud and false prophet, this critic notes that while Swedenborg was veiled in figures, tropes, and parables, it is not so with Joseph Smith. He speaks plainly, he lies openly, and hopes to succeed by inspiring falsehood with the fearlessness of truth. Thus, neither critic saw the parallels which modern critics are so keen to insist were there. Fair uses the observations of John A. Clark and Walter Scott, both devout ministers more preoccupied with debunking Joseph Smith's Book of Mormon claims than delving into his doctrinal borrowings, to support their case. Yet, this cherry-picked focus on their criticisms ignores the broader context of theological developments in Joseph Smith's time. These ministers weren't interested in parsing the esoteric connections between Joseph Smith's ideas and those of Swedenborg. Their primary concern was defending Orthodox Christianity against Joseph's audacious claims. What does BYU have to say on this subject? They attempt to bolster their argument by turning to Colleen McDaniel and Bernhard Lang, quoting from Heaven, a History, that in some form, different degrees of glory do exist in the heavenly realm. According to McDaniel and Lang, the understanding of life after death in the LDS Church is the clearest example of the continuation of the modern heaven into the 20th century, because of Latter-day Saint adherence to a theology of heaven that comprises beliefs that once were more widely held, or at least more widely considered, by others, but beliefs once widely held. This oversimplifies the historical reality. Early Christian thought was anything but monolithic. Figures like Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, and Origen espoused varying teachings, many of which, including degrees of heavenly glory and the Trinity, originated long after the time of Jesus. What BYU omits is just as telling as what they include: the competing diverse views of heaven held by dozens of early Christian sects. Paulinism, the theological foundation for much of mainstream Christianity, was only one interpretation among many. BYU continues with an interesting rhetorical question. At this point, one might ask, if the notion of heavenly degrees of glory was not uncommon in Joseph Smith's day, why focus so much on the question of Swedenborg's influence? Two responses seem relevant. First, the prophet apparently mentioned Swedenborg by name during an 1839 conversation with Edward Hunter, a student of Swedenborgianism, who later became a Latter-day Saint. Hunter had established a seminary dedicated to the free exchange of religious ideas, and when Joseph Smith stopped at this Nantmeal Seminary in Pennsylvania during a return trip from Washington, D.C., Hunter reported this exchange. I asked him if he was acquainted with the Swedenborgers. His answer, I verily believe. Emanuel Swedenborg had a view of the world to come, but for daily food he perished. If accurately remembered, this remark generates a whole range of questions. Indeed it does. If Swedenborg's teachings on heavenly glories were already familiar to Joseph, as this exchange with Hunter suggests, why deny their possible influence on his theological innovations? While Fair and BYU attempt to minimize the significance of these connections, the facts tell a different story. Swedenborg's ideas, though fringe, were known in certain intellectual and religious circles, particularly along the eastern seaboard. Universalism is perhaps the closest surviving remnant of Swedenborgianism, but during Joseph's time, such ideas circulated within small but vibrant communities. Moreover, Joseph wasn't the only one exposed to Swedenborg's works. Sidney Rigdon, Joseph's most trusted lieutenant during the early years of the church, was well-read and deeply engaged with theological writings of the time. Rigdon's familiarity with Swedenborgian concepts adds weight to the argument that these ideas influenced the doctrines of the early LDS Church. The parallels between Swedenborg's multi-tiered heavens and Joseph Smith's degrees of glory are not a coincidence, nor can they be dismissed as insignificant. Despite Fair and BYU's evasions, the historical connections are clear. The theological borrowing is undeniable, even if the church and its defenders work tirelessly to obscure it. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. I'd love to hear your views. Thank you so kindly for watching. This is the Ex-Mormon Informant signing off for today.